lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother. It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. The interview was a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse and has since hurt countless others.
In a moment no one expected, Prince William finally addressed Meghan with words that cut through years of silence. This was not diplomacy, not tradition, not a carefully softened royal phrase. It was tragic, final, and impossible to undo. Sources say the statement ended lingering hopes and exposed fractures long hidden behind palace walls. So, why did William choose now to speak so directly? What pressures forced his hand? And how did one sentence transform a private family rift into a historic turning point for the monarchy? The moment. The door finally closed. It did not arrive wrapped in ceremony or softened by tradition. It arrived suddenly, with the weight of finality, as if history itself had paused to listen. On the morning of December 2nd, 2025, Prince William did something no future king is expected to do lightly. He stepped forward personally and put his name to words that would permanently alter the course of royal history. Within minutes, the message spread across newsrooms and royal circles, not because it was loud, but because it was unmistakably clear. There would be no return, no reconsideration, no quiet reversal later. What had lingered for years as uncertainty ended in a single, irreversible stroke. This was not the palace speaking through carefully balanced language or anonymous briefings. This was Prince William, directly, publicly, and deliberately. His decision to attach his own name stripped away any remaining ambiguity and signaled how horrendous the moment had become. Royal watchers immediately recognized the rarity of such an intervention. Statements of this magnitude are usually filtered through layers of protocol, but this one bore the unmistakable mark of personal resolve. It was not routine governance, it was an intervention. At the heart of the statement was a firm declaration. There would be no pathway for Meghan Markle's return to royal life in any capacity. Not now, not later, not under altered terms. The door was not simply closed, it was sealed. For many, the shock lay not in the outcome itself, but in the certainty of it. For years, speculation had survived on the idea that he might soften positions or that circumstances could change. William's words ended that narrative completely. This was not a pause. It was an ending. The timing made the moment even more striking. December 2nd, 2025, now stands as a clear dividing line before and after. Insiders would later describe it as the day private tensions crossed fully into public record. Unlike previous moments, where the monarchy relied on silence or distance, this announcement acknowledged that ambiguity itself had become damaging. The future king was no longer willing to let uncertainty speak louder than clarity. What gave the statement its tragic weight was not anger or accusation, but restraint. William did not frame the message as punishment or retaliation. Instead, the tone carried a heavy sense of necessity. Sometimes leadership, especially within institutions built on continuity, demands decisions that feel deeply personal yet must be made for survival. That tension between family and duty echoed through every line. The reaction was immediate. News outlets described the move as unprecedented. Royal correspondents, long accustomed to cautious language from the palace, struggled to recall another moment quite like it. Behind the scenes, the message was just as clear. The monarchy was drawing a firm boundary, not out of impulse, but out of accumulated pressure that could no longer be managed quietly. For Meghan, the words carried a finality that left no space for interpretation. Hopes, assumptions, and lingering expectations collapsed in an instant. For William, the cost was equally real. This was not a symbolic gesture, but a defining act, one that revealed how far circumstances had pushed him. And as the world absorbed the significance of what had just been said, one truth became impossible to ignore. Something had broken beyond repair, and the future would now have to be built without looking back. So, what do you think truly shattered beyond repair? Was it them, their trust, or something no one noticed? Stay tuned. The pressure that left no room for silence. Almost as soon as Prince William's statement reverberated across headlines, a single question rose above the noise. Why now? For years, the monarchy had relied on distance, restraint, and carefully maintained silence to manage internal fractures. That approach had often worked, allowing tensions to fade from public view without direct confrontation. But by late 2025, silence had stopped being a shield. It had become a liability. What unfolded on December 2, 2025 was not a sudden change of heart, but the visible result of pressures that had been tightening for months, quietly but relentlessly. Behind palace walls, the situation surrounding Meghan Markle had reached a point where ambiguity itself was causing damage. Every unanswered question invited speculation. Every vague position allowed new interpretations to form. The monarchy, an institution built on clarity of role and order, was being pulled into a state of constant reaction. Media narratives no longer drifted in isolation. They collided with official engagements, overshadowed carefully planned appearances, and bled into moments meant to highlight unity and continuity. What once felt manageable had become destabilizing. Prince William, preparing for a future defined by responsibility rather than flexibility, found himself confronting a reality he could no longer delay. The idea that time alone would ease tensions no longer held. Each passing month brought new complications, new distractions, and renewed scrutiny. Silence, once a strategic choice, now amplifies uncertainty. And uncertainty, within a monarchy, carries consequences far beyond personal discomfort. It affects public trust, institutional credibility, and the perception of leadership itself. At the heart of this growing strain was a hard truth that palace advisors and senior figures could no longer avoid. Meghan's position had become institutionally impossible. This was not about emotion, nor about revisiting past disagreements. It was about structure. The monarchy depends on defined roles, clear boundaries, and a shared understanding of duty. Meghan's continued association without any formal pathway or defined status created confusion that could not be reconciled within the system. There was no middle ground left to occupy. William's decision to speak was shaped by this convergence of pressures. As future king, he could not afford prolonged ambiguity that weakened the institution he would one day lead. Each unresolved question carried forward into his own reign, threatening to follow him rather than fade with time. The cost of waiting had begun to outweigh the cost of acting. And so, the moment arrived when restraint no longer signaled strength, but hesitation. What made this moment especially intense was its inevitability. The statement did not emerge from anger or impulse, but from calculation and responsibility. Those close to the process understood that William had reached a threshold where leadership demanded clarity, even if that clarity carried personal loss. The monarchy had arrived at a breaking point where protecting its future required drawing a line that could not be blurred later. In speaking when he did, William transformed a long-running question into a definitive answer. The tragedy lay not in the firmness of the words, but in the fact that they had become unavoidable. This was not a decision born from emotion, but from necessity, shaped by months of strain that left no room for delay and no safe place left for silence to hide. Now, what unseen consequences will ripple from a choice no one expected? Keep watching. Inside the storm, no one was meant to see. By the time Prince William chose clarity over silence, the decision had already been shaped by months of pressure unfolding far from public view. What the world saw as sudden was, inside palace walls, the result of a slow, grinding strain that refused to ease. Throughout much of 2025, senior aides and communications teams watched patterns emerge that felt increasingly deliberate, not accidental. Stories involving Meghan Markle did not simply appear. They arrived with timing so precise that it began to raise alarms. Royal schedules are planned well in advance, and patterns become impossible to ignore when headlines consistently surface at critical moments. Each time Prince William or Catherine stepped into the spotlight for major engagements, particularly those meant to highlight stability or progress, attention was abruptly redirected. Palace insiders noted how negative or distracting stories often surfaced just hours before key appearances, hijacking the narrative and forcing defensive responses. What initially seemed like coincidence slowly took on a more troubling shape. One incident in particular intensified internal concern. While Prince William was in Brazil, representing the monarchy on an important international visit, reports suddenly circulated claiming Meghan Markle had been spotted, triggering another wave of speculation and headlines. The overlap was striking. William's team became acutely aware of how such stories consistently coincided with moments when focus should have been elsewhere. According to royal analysts, including commentary later referenced by Kinsey Schofield, this was no longer viewed as random media behavior. It was seen as interference. Behind closed doors, palace communications teams began mapping timelines, comparing engagements against headline releases. The similarities were too frequent to dismiss. What had once been treated as background noise was now considered a strategic problem. The monarchy, already under intense scrutiny, found itself repeatedly pulled into reactive mode. Each disruption weakened control over messaging and eroded the sense of authority the institution depends upon. As these patterns intensified, concern spread beyond public relations. Security briefings began to reflect the consequences of heightened online activity. Coordinated negative campaigns, some aggressive enough to warrant formal assessment, were increasingly targeting senior royals. Catherine, in particular, felt the weight of this escalation. What began as media pressure now carried emotional and personal consequences, affecting daily life and family well-being. The palace could no longer separate headlines from real-world impact. Internally, the belief took hold that the monarchy was facing something more complex than unfavorable press. Advisors described it as a pressure cooker effect, where media manipulation, Public perception and institutional vulnerability were feeding into one another. The Sussex situation, unresolved and undefined, acted as a constant trigger point. Every new story reopened old questions and prolonged instability. For Prince William, this shift was pivotal. The realization that private family tensions had evolved into institutional threats forced a reevaluation of earlier restraint. Silence was no longer containing the problem. It was enabling it. The longer matters remained unresolved, the easier it became for external forces to exploit uncertainty. This was no longer about managing relationships quietly, but about protecting the monarchy's ability to function without constant disruption. As the internal evidence mounted, so did the urgency. What had once been managed through patience and distance now demanded a firmer response. The walls of the palace, long relied upon to absorb pressure, were no longer holding it back. And with each passing week, the cost of inaction grew heavier, pushing Prince William closer to a decision that would reshape everything. As secrets clawed their way into the open, could the crown survive the storm within, or would everything collapse? Stay glued. When the battle reached the heart of the family, as the pressure mounted inside palace walls, the crisis began to shift in a deeply personal direction. What had started as an institutional challenge, measured in headlines and strategy meetings, gradually found its way into the most private corners of family life. For Prince William, this was the moment when the issue stopped being only about the monarchy and became unmistakably about protecting those closest to him. At the center of that shift stood Catherine. Throughout much of 2025, Catherine had quietly absorbed the strain that came with the relentless media cycle. Publicly, she continued her work with calm face, appearing composed and committed to her causes. Privately, however, she began to notice a pattern that unsettled her. Media stories did not simply criticize or speculate. They seemed to rise in direct response to her public initiatives. Moments meant to highlight her work or reinforce stability were repeatedly overshadowed by sudden negative narratives. To Catherine, this no longer felt like a coincidence. It felt targeted. By early November, the weight of these experiences could no longer be carried alone. In private conversations with William, she spoke candidly about what she was seeing and feeling. She described how the constant media storms were no longer confined to headlines, but were seeping into daily life, creating an atmosphere of unease that followed them home. Security concerns, once abstract and procedural, had become personal. Briefings grew more serious, and the tone shifted from precaution to vigilance. What troubled Catherine most was not her own public image, but the effect this environment was having on their family. The sense of being watched, analyzed, and attacked eroded the feeling of safety that home is meant to provide. It affected routines, decisions, and the simple freedom to live without constant alertness. She made it clear that this was no longer sustainable, especially with their children growing more aware of the world around them. These conversations struck William deeply. Long known for his protective instincts, he found them sharpened by the realization that the situation was no longer contained within palace walls. What had been framed as a distant dispute now carried real consequences for his wife and children. The line between public duty and private life had blurred beyond recognition. For William, this was not just about reputation or tradition, it was about safeguarding the people he loved. Catherine's perspective added a powerful emotional urgency to decisions already difficult with responsibility. Her observations confirmed what advisors had warned, that unresolved tensions were creating a ripple effect, touching every part of their lives. The attacks were no longer faceless or theoretical. They were felt in moments of anxiety, in tightened security protocols, and in the constant need to be on guard. Watching Catherine shoulder this burden changed the nature of William's resolve. Leadership, he understood, could not come at the cost of family well-being. Protecting the monarchy's future meant first protecting its core. The idea of continuing with vague boundaries suddenly felt reckless, not restrained. Catherine's breaking point became a turning point, transforming months of strategic concern into a deeply human imperative. From that moment on, the question was no longer whether action would be taken, but how quickly clarity could be restored before the damage reached further into the lives they were trying so carefully to shield. Could one fragile moment of truth unravel decades of careful strategy? Or will the line between duty and heart endure? Stay with us. Where emotion ended and rules took control. After the emotional weight of Catherine's concerns reshaped the urgency of the situation, the next phase unfolded with far less warmth and far more precision. Inside the palace, the conversation shifted sharply from feelings to facts, from protection to procedure. In early November 2025, senior legal advisors were brought in to conduct a comprehensive review of the Sussex situation, and what they uncovered stripped the matter of any remaining flexibility. The law, unlike emotion, offered no room for hesitation. At the heart of the review was one persistent problem: ambiguity. Meghan Markle's undefined status within the royal framework had become a legal risk rather than a personal complication. Without clear boundaries, the institution faced exposure on multiple fronts. Advisors warned that loosely defined relationships could open the door to future claims, misunderstandings, or disputes over expectations that were never formally set. In an institution governed by precedent and protocol, uncertainty was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Security was one of the most immediate concerns. Royal protection operates on strict rules tied directly to official roles and responsibilities. An unclear position complicated decisions about protection, especially during international travel or high-profile moments. Legal experts stress that ambiguity could lead to gaps in coverage, confusion over authority, and increased vulnerability. What might appear manageable on paper became far more serious when translated into real-world risk. Beyond security, constitutional implications loomed large. The monarchy's structure depends on clearly defined lines of duty and succession. Any perception that roles could be flexible or informally reassigned threatened to undermine that structure. Advisors cautioned that continued uncertainty could fuel public confusion, raise questions about the future involvement of non-working royals, and weaken confidence in the institution's stability. Reputational damage, once set in motion, would be difficult to contain. The legal team's conclusions were direct and uncompromising. Maintaining a vague or hopeful position was no longer an option. Their recommendation was clear. The monarchy needed firm, unambiguous, and final boundaries. Anything less would prolong exposure to avoidable risk. Each delay increased the chance of future legal challenges, security failures, or constitutional controversy. For an institution already navigating public scrutiny and internal strain, this was a risk too great to accept. For Prince William and King Charles, the findings forced a confrontation with an uncomfortable reality. Good intentions and patience could not override legal necessity. While emotional considerations had driven urgency, it was the legal framework that removed any remaining choice. The advisors made it clear that decisive action now would prevent far greater complications later. Waiting, they warned, would only deepen the eventual fallout. This phase of the crisis marked a turning point. What had begun as a painful family matter and evolved into an institutional concern was now firmly grounded in legal obligation. The tragedy of the situation lay in this collision between human relationships and rigid structures. Once the law drew its line, there was no space left to negotiate. As these conclusions were absorbed within the palace, the path forward narrowed dramatically. The decision was no longer about what felt right or wrong, but about what was required to protect the monarchy from lasting harm. And with legal clarity replacing emotional debate, the outcome moved from possibility to inevitability, setting the stage for consequences that would soon extend far beyond Britain's borders. Now, as power shifts behind closed doors, which hidden truth will shatter the palace walls, and who will survive its fallout? Keep watching. When the world started watching too closely. Once the legal conclusions were laid bare, it became clear that the consequences of inaction would not stop at palace gates. What had begun as a deeply personal and institutional struggle was now spilling onto the international stage. By late 2025, the turbulence surrounding the Sussex situation had begun to register beyond Britain, prompting quiet but serious concern among the country's diplomatic partners. The monarchy, long regarded as a pillar of British identity and influence, was being viewed through a lens of uncertainty. Behind the scenes, officials at the Foreign Office took note. Senior diplomats raised alarms about how the ongoing instability was being perceived abroad. While no public statements were made, internal discussions reflected growing unease. Allied nations were increasingly aware of the visible fractures within the royal family, and with that awareness came questions. Could the monarchy still function as a reliable symbol of continuity? Could it continue to support Britain's global standing without distraction or doubt? These concerns came to a head in November 2025, when a senior Foreign Office figure requested urgent discussions. The message was measured but unmistakable. International partners were watching closely, and the prolonged uncertainty surrounding the Sussex issue was beginning to cast a shadow over Britain's soft power. The monarchy plays a unique role in diplomacy, serving as a cultural anchor and a symbol of stability that transcends politics. When that symbol appears unsettled, its influence weakens. For Prince William, these warnings carried particular weight. As the future king, his role would extend far beyond ceremonial duties. He is expected to represent Britain on the world stage, build relationships with global leaders, and embody consistency in an unpredictable world. Any perception that he could not manage unity within his own family risked undermining confidence in his ability to navigate far larger challenges. What might have been dismissed as tabloid drama now had tangible diplomatic implications. The issue was no longer about individual grievances or media narratives. It had become a question of credibility. Allies did not issue demands, but the implications were clear. Unresolved instability threatened Britain's international image. The longer the situation lingered, the more it chipped away at the monarchy's role as a steady, unifying force. In diplomacy, perception matters almost as much as reality, and perceptions are shifting. This global dimension intensified the pressure already bearing down on William. Legal risks had narrowed his options, and family concerns had sharpened his resolve. Now, international expectations added another layer of responsibility. Leadership at this level required decisiveness, not hesitation. The idea of carrying unresolved conflict into his future reign became increasingly untenable. What made this stage especially sobering was its scale. The decision William faced would not only define his relationship with Meghan, or even his immediate family, but would echo how Britain was viewed across continents. The monarchy's influence depends on trust, stability, and clarity. Without those, its ability to serve as a diplomatic asset diminishes. As warnings from abroad joined pressures at home, the reality became unavoidable. The Sussex situation was no longer contained within family or institution. It had become a matter of national and international significance. And with the world now watching, the cost of delay grew heavier still, pushing events toward a conclusion that would soon reshape the monarchy's future and redefine William's path as a global statesman. And as the world watches, will silence protect the crown, or expose cracks that could redefine the monarchy forever? The silence that followed. The final decision. After the warnings from abroad and the legal lines drawn at home, the moment that followed Prince William's decision carried a different kind of weight. It was quieter, heavier, and far more reflective. The urgency that had driven the process gave way to something more sobering, the realization of what had been permanently lost. When William's statement was issued on December 2, 1925, it did more than clarify the monarchy's position. It closed a chapter that could never be reopened, no matter how time might soften emotions. For Meghan Markle, the consequences were immediate and absolute. The announcement did not merely limit future involvement, it ended it entirely. Any remaining connection to royal life, however symbolic, was severed. There would be no official role, no ceremonial participation, and no pathway back into the institutional framework that defines the monarchy. What had once existed as possibility, however remote, disappeared in a single declaration. The finality was not dramatic in tone, but it was devastating in implication. One of the most tangible losses was security. Royal protection is not a personal privilege, but a function of duty and role. With the door firmly closed, access to official security arrangements tied to the institution was withdrawn. This shift underscored the seriousness of the decision. It was not symbolic distance, but practical separation. Alongside security, all forms of official support, representation, and involvement in future royal events came to an end. The separation was complete, not partial. The impact extended beyond Meghan herself. The statement left no ambiguity about the future of her children within the royal structure. Palace insiders and commentators, including Kinsey Schofield, made it clear that there would be no role for them as working royals, now or later. The idea that they might one day choose to return and assume official duties was described as unrealistic and unsupported by any existing framework. The institution had drawn its boundary, not just for the present, but for generations ahead. This aspect of the decision carried its own quiet tragedy. Children, often seen as bridges between divided worlds, were now firmly placed outside the monarchy's future working core. The statement did not frame this as a rejection, but as a consequence. The monarchy, bound by structure and continuity, could not accommodate undefined roles or conditional returns. In choosing stability, it accepted permanent separation. For Prince William, the personal cost of this moment was impossible to ignore. This was not a victory, nor a display of authority for its own sake. It was an acceptance that leadership sometimes requires closing doors that once held meaning. Those close to William understood that the decision weighed heavily on him, shaped by months of pressure, concern for his family, and responsibility to the institution he would one day lead. His words were not about blame, but about boundaries. This moment is now widely seen as one that will define William's future reign, not because of its severity, but because of what it reveals about his approach to leadership. Faced with overlapping pressures, emotional, legal, and diplomatic, he chose clarity over comfort. He accepted that unresolved relationships, when left to linger, can destabilize not only families, but institutions built on trust and order. In drawing a final line, he demonstrated a willingness to make decisions that protect the whole, even when the cost is deeply personal. The tragedy of the situation lies in its inevitability. By the time the statement was made, alternatives had already collapsed under the weight of risk and uncertainty. Silence had failed. Ambiguity had become dangerous. What remained was a choice between prolonged instability and decisive separation. William chose the latter, fully aware that it would be misunderstood by some and painful for many. As the implications continue to unfold, this moment stands as a reminder that the monarchy's greatest challenges are often not external, but internal. The closing of this door reshaped the future for Meghan and her children, but it also reshaped the expectations placed on William. His leadership will now be measured against this decision, seen as a defining act of resolve that prioritized stability over sentiment and duty over hope, even as its emotional weight continues to settle quietly in the background. So, what do you think happens when duty outweighs blood and silence is no longer an option? Was Prince William protecting the future or ending a family forever? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.